Hello, welcome again to another edition of our Let's Talk Climate Change series at Azim Premji University. Today is a special honor for me to have a very old and dear friend and colleague, Professor Christine Fürst from Martin Luther University at Halle in Germany. And she's come all the way. She's here spending a month in India. And so we're pulling her in. She's doing a public lecture for us at Bangalore International Center. But also this is an opportunity for us to talk to you, Christine, and get some sense of your very long and extensive experience working with forests in different parts of the world, looking at ecosystem services, landscape ecology, sustainable development goals, modeling. I mean, you've done such a fascinating variety of things. So welcome. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much, dear Harini, for this warm welcome. And also, I was very fascinated to come here and to learn about your current work and the university. So it's a big chance also for partnering. So I hope we can also discuss afterwards a little bit how to extend our cooperation on sustainability and climate change. That would be great.
That's wonderful. So let me start with sort of where I start many times, which is where did you grow up and how close were you to nature when you grew up?
I was growing up in a relatively rural area, close to Nuremberg, but still a village. Mm-hmm. And so that's maybe also my background. I learned first from my grandparents to run in the forest, pick mushrooms, collect herbs. Then I learned swimming in the natural waters, observing animals. So that was my youth experience, and it brought me close to nature, and also generated my wish to study something which is not, let me say, so far away from nature, but where I can do actively something outside. So there was a little competition. I thought first I would study biology, but then I realized I'm such much in laboratories and working only on the micro scale, and I wanted to work with nature and people. So I developed relatively early this vision, there should be something I can do. And then I learned you can study forest sciences. And I said immediately, yes, that's it.
Wonderful. So were you, because you use so much of modeling and math and physics and just a systems approach. And you're also someone who, as you said, you started working in the lab in biology?
No. Originally, I thought about studying biology because forestry was not provided by the closed universities. So I had to get a little bit far away because you can study forestry only in 4 sites in Germany. So I selected Munich. So I had simply to go to another region and to do my studies. Yeah.
But what were your interests in school? I mean, I'm asking this also from the perspective of, and you know this, we've discussed this many times, that there are such few women that do modeling, remote sensing, the tech part of ecology. Let's put it this way.
Yeah, I was at nature sciences gym at gymnasium is the word in Germany, high school at the time. And I was fascinated about chemistry, about biology, but also about history, about languages. And so I grew somehow up in this more interdisciplinary thinking and the fascination also to do something which is at the interface between natural sciences and social sciences. Yeah.
And as a woman growing up in those times, was there any how do I put it, in the high school or the college environment, was there any implicit or explicit things of girls are more suited to do these kinds of things and not suited to do those kinds of things, or was it a very open?
No, not in that school. That was really an exception, a very exploratory school, which was the first one working on inclusion.
So it was a special school
very special situation. Yeah. So we had a huge area, huge gardens, laboratory facilities. We had also a relatively high amount of people from other countries. So it was a kind of, let me say, field where you could explore a lot of interculturality, but also explore different disciplines.
So how does that, how come they had, so it was a high school with students from other countries?
Not students, but pupils from other countries. Yeah. Okay. So we had roughly 1,300 pupils. And so at that time, it was one of the relatively single schools where you had such a broad choice and where also people wanted to bring their children. So they were very selective. Okay. And I had good luck to be selected. So I enjoyed a wonderful
Which also makes me think, because you work interdisciplinarily, but you also work collaboratively with so many people from different places. So do you think that sort of stimulated an early desire?
I think this was already the basis for, because we were aware there are other cultures we could meet in the school. We had also a nice school cafe. We were responsible for the disabled colleagues, so we learned a totally different school life, much more holistic maybe than the normal governmental schools.
And how large were your class sizes?
The class sizes were around 30
so
pupils.
Small enough to do some kind of guided one-on-one thing. Interesting. And then from there, you went to forestry. And we were talking a little bit before this. I hadn't realized, despite having lived in Germany for some time, that about half the forests, you said, in Germany are private forests?
Yes, 50%.
That's impressive. And so you have private forests, government forests, and municipal forests. Yeah. And 30% of Germany's area is forested, which I knew, of course. Yeah. So forestry becomes very important for Germany, but also for us from India, because, of course, we had a lot of German foresters who came to India during British colonial times and left us a legacy of forestry here. And when I started working in Nepal in the early 2000s and I went to Nepal, I realized many Nepali foresters study in India, but what they pick up is the German forestry techniques. So German forestry is, of course, influential far beyond South Asia. Yeah. And what did you find when you went into the German forestry model? Because you work on sustainability. And the German forestry model was initially evolved in terms of looking at it as timber and production and not as sustainability, but it has changed.
Sustainability started more than 300 years ago by Hans Carl von Kallowitz, Silvicultura Economica, and the idea behind was to conserve the resource, because people realized very early that if they harvest too much, then they don't have enough for the next years. So sustainability started really from a resource economic perspective, and later on, of course, ecological aspects came in, particularly when we had this period of forest decline in the 1970s, 1980s. Then people became aware that it's not enough to conserve the resource, but also the processes and the species diversity, and to care for the forest much more intensively than they did before. We had a lot of breakouts of insects always in the past, and the lectures learned that we cannot simply plant the same tree species again and hope it will somehow work. These have been established then over centuries, and actually a lot of people from abroad are trained in Germany. So we have the tropical forestry in Tarrant in Dresden University, but also in Göttingen. So there are a lot of colleagues from other countries, and they split this knowledge, how to manage sustainably, how to do permanent continuous cover forestry instead of simple clear cut, how to support natural processes to save money, of course, but also to give more resilience to the forests. So that's definitively something which where a lot of also bad lectures have been over centuries, where we saw, some things did not work as we thought we should make them work. And so step by step, concepts were developed also how to regenerate forests that are monocultures by little incentives, even using birds to bring the seeds in and then to see how this develops.
That is very interesting, because what you're pointing to is, I think, in many places in India, also the same journey. In the 1970s and 80s, of course, we tried to do a lot of social forestry where we planted eucalyptus because it grows very fast. It comes from Australia. The pests haven't come with the eucalyptus, and it grows and Acacia auriculiformis, which is also not native. But now we've realized it's not as simple as a binary between native and not native, of course, but it's a thing of what is the biodiversity, how is it used by the people, and no monoculture is good, even if it's sort of a local monoculture.
We still have monocultures, of course, because this is part of our history and you cannot change them from one day to the other. But what we try to do in forestry is, of course, to support regeneration of the indigenous tree species, more broadly the forest, because these are usually better adapted. We see it also with concern that, of course, our hate levels due to climate change where specific forest types are growing, they are changing now, and this means that some forest types will disappear and have to be replaced by others. This is subject to a lot of research at the moment, because we are facing these dry spells a lot of outbreaks of insects, but also then forest fires, a lot of decline. Yeah, the soil is depleted. So there's many things that we need to renew now, and where we have to study false chronosequences or so in other regions. How are people and how is nature dealing with the very dry climate and with the winters where you have no frost anymore? So that's something where we have not yet ready solutions, I would say.
Yeah, and I don't think anywhere in the world, I mean, the same challenges in India.
I mean, we have to renew our studies, and that is a big threat that I perceive from the actual research policies. They always tell us you have enough data, simply aggregate and synthesize the data and do something with them. I say, yeah, but the situation is changing. Particularly now we see how climate change is speeding up, and we need much more research to understand what could it be in the future, yeah? And we need also to look to other regions, yeah, to learn what could we do better. Right. And I think this is also a dispute with the nature conservationists, because they want to conserve the situation as we have it. But this is not possible. No, yeah, nature will develop further, and we have to be ready to accept this and
in
to
fact,
support
some of our
processes.
research in India, we're looking at protected areas as the remnants of natural vegetation. I mean, as natural as it gets, I guess. And what we find is so much of the focus is on protecting and conserving, as you said, conservation ecology. But then what you find is climatic parameters are shifting, species boundaries are shifting. As well as cities are getting close to protected areas. And we're not looking at these two big changes, urbanization at one hand and climate change at the other hand.
I mean, that's one of the big problems that I perceived also traveling a little bit in India here. I mean, the big land hunger, I can understand it. I think you have 1.7 billion people at the moment, so to feed them and to provide them space is definitively a huge challenge. But if I was, for instance, in Missouri now to have a little look on this wonderful area, but I see with concern all these settlements growing into the forest. You might have a lot of landslides, and you destroy the regulative capacities of these landscapes. And this is something which will cost a lot in the future if we don't understand that it has a reason why we should keep land cover in specific areas. Yeah.
So that brings me to my next question, because you did then a master's in forestry and you went on to do a PhD in soil health.
Yeah.
And then you did a post-habilitation in natural resource management, which I presume was the first time you started looking at landscape ecology?
Yeah, it's...
And can you, for viewers who might not understand what landscape ecology is, can you sort of explain a bit and tell us why you got interested in landscape ecology?
It started from research. So from the beginning on, I was not a normal PhD student, but I did the state forest training, and then I took over simply large-scale research projects. So definitively in the coordination.
So you were working as a forester and then you moved to research?
Yes. Then I moved back to research because I realized administration is maybe nothing for me. It's too, let me say, boring and doesn't correspond to me. I want to do something creative. And so I started with the coordination of big research projects where I had to include anyhow many disciplines and where I was forced to go at the landscape scale. So of course I did my PhD in forest soil science, but again looking at the landscape scale. So I looked at former pollution impacts in this black triangle, Leipzig, Halle-Wittenberg, and I wanted to understand how abundant is the pollution still and how relevant it is for the drinking water quality, for instance. So I had to go to larger scales, to go to transects across the landscape. So definitively I started with that and with the geospatial modeling at the time. And then funnily, through all the stakeholder processes that I organized around our research projects, I came into contact with many people that said, do you not have an idea what we could do at the border between Czech Republic, Poland, and Germany to manage better the flood events? I said, well, I have not yet a clue, but let me develop an idea. And so I came really unintended to working at a large landscape scale, looking at the headwaters, at agricultural and forest areas, at the pattern that are relevant for flooding events. And I started developing a system from the scratch, having no idea what is existing so far because I came from a totally different area. But it turned out to be so successful that I got more and more money from different research agencies that said, this is simple. It's a raster-based model. You can develop your own scenarios. People can simply draw something in and they get a response. Yeah, they see what does this mean. Yeah, in terms of capacities of a landscape, of risk maps, and so on.
Do you think the fact that you made a model that someone can play with and understand, someone who's not a scientist can play with, it came because you had worked as a forester before you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we developed this also as a game for pupils. So very simple, but to understand what sustainability is, if you explain it, it is too abstract. But if you give them their own landscape, very simple, and they can start drawing something and they learn, oh, there is a reaction, yeah? And we did it with a nice avatar, a beaver. The beaver is warning if you lose something, the beaver gives you applause if you gain something. And we took very simple parameters. This means providing drinkable water, how beautiful is the landscape, how much money can I earn, also through tourism, and how many animals can live there. So very simple. But they had then to do something good. They had to improve their own environment. And then they learned very easily, if I put one land use, it might be good for one aspect, but maybe not so good for others. So the typical, there are trade-off analysis. And by playing, they learned very fast. Yeah. And at the end, they got also a graphical interpretation of the landscape so that they had a result they could show. And they really liked it. It was called Pimp Your Landscape.
I saw that. I thought, whoa.
And I was very taken by that. When I developed it as a scientific tool and later on as a tool for pupils, I got a very bad remarks, particularly from US reviewers. Yeah, how can you call a tool Pimp Your Landscape? And I thought it's funny because you have Pimp Your Life, Pimp Your whatever, and I thought, why not Pimp Your Landscape? Yeah. Later on, I changed it then. But that was, I think it came through my experience as a forester. And I developed also another game where you could play with forests, yeah, where you have the same reason behind and you have to try to make it better, yeah. But then you have to learn you cannot, optimize only with one species, but you have to do a kind of bundle of species. And landscape ecology came in when we presented this tool to planners. They said, yeah, it's all nice. You can do ecosystem services assessment with it. But what about the impact of landscape character, connectivity, fragmentation, yeah? All these things, how do you account for different services? I said, okay, I have no clue. We will work on it.
And you had not done anything with landscape ecology too?
I mean, I heard about, yes, in my studies, but I'm not a trained landscape ecologist. It was more, let me say,
that is interesting for someone who then became the International Association of Landscape Ecology president for 5 years.
Four. But yeah, but it was more learning because I'm a curious person and I wanted to understand systems. And so I approached it step by step and discussed a lot with people. So what should we include as knowledge base? And for instance, when we come back to climate change, the landscape character, the configuration, composition plays a huge role for all services related to water or to environment. And I had a nice colleague, a PhD student, and then we sat together and thought, okay, what can we take? Yeah, let's take about these landscape metrics, but there are no studies how landscape metrics are related to ecosystem services. So it was the first time that we came up with a lot of assumptions and tried also to analyze a lot of literature, how far are different species traveling? So from when on can we speak on fragmentation and losses and disconnected natural areas? How can we incorporate knowledge from hydrological modeling and a lot of other things?
So I have to ask you this. I mean, one of the things, my own sense of how powerful games can be, you might remember a game called SimCity, which used to be there. So I used to play that, and that was very interesting because I was learning Java and trying to think of landscape modeling for a while when I was in San Diego in 1998. But also, I think I later realized how powerful they are when, I think it must have been 2006 or 2007, Elinor Ostrom had a workshop, which is in Arizona State University, and they did all these games on behavior in the commons. And we had one game where, so 6 of us sitting behind machines, you didn't know who was doing what, and we had agreed together not to over-harvest trees. And there is something there which says that nobody wants to be a sucker. And this is one of Lynn Ostrom's one of her favorite things. She would bang on the table when she said, nobody wants to be a sucker, right? And when I realized that one person whose greed can completely destabilize the community, because there's one person who was cutting down trees too much. I still don't know who it was. Yeah? And I got so angry, I decided to chase them and keep cutting down more trees than they did just because they were doing this. And then I realized how irrational it was after I put the game down. But in the game, I was behaving like a human being and not like an optimizing scientist. And then you realize it's very important to do things as people, and then you realize how the management hat comes out, right?
I mean, we do something similar also, for instance, in urban planning. We have a huge touch table and, of course, some handholds for outside. And very often people have an idea how they want to develop the urban area, but always with a focus where I live, it should be nice and green. Of course, we need some economy and some business areas, but please not in my backyard. And so if you take different groups, this is called charrette. And then put together the results, then they can also see how harmful their decisions would be for the others. So that's a very good way for discussing and also giving them an idea that their own visions are often very local and are not helpful for the full system. Yeah, and so we use again this game for that, or also some other opportunity. We use, for instance, very often Bayesian belief network modeling, because this helps pretty much to give people an idea of the system architecture and how these different aspects, like the land use, like urbanization, how they play together. Yeah, so we use it often more as a kind of communicative tool for the modeling, of course, in the background, but also to give people the opportunity to learn about their systems and to learn how much perceptions are deviating from what happens if you realize your plans. Yeah. And this is very helpful. So there we have a lot of positive experiences. We use it a lot of in Africa, because there I was building this or contributing to building the West African Science Service Center for Climate Change and Adapted Land Use. And there we had quite some works, very, very local ones, participatory ones, where we talked with the farmers and these offices that are consulting farmers, how to improve the management regarding to climate change scenarios. And we figured out their perception is if they change something, particularly in the cropping, in this mixed cropping and cropping sequences, they always fear they will harvest less water or have a higher water demand, which actually is not true. So by using their perceptions and our modeled knowledge, we could show them if you change something, this does not harm. Yeah, you might have even higher resilience. So that was also a way of communicating. Yeah.
So we always say systems, systems, social ecological systems for climate, for sustainability. But I'm just thinking of, and we've had maybe 15 minutes of conversation. You already mentioned soil science, forestry, modeling, remote sensing, landscape fragmentation metrics, modeling connectivity, future. So I'm assuming with grid cells, Bayesian networks, Bayesian calculations of human behavior, games. Yes, you're curious. I mean, I'm also curious and similarly have moved from fields to fields. But sometimes knowledge or let's say capacity you might learn about some new field. Let's say you're thinking of behavioral modeling or you're thinking of soil science, but you might not have the courage to pick it up. Many people do that. And there's a lot of young people looking at this, so people who want to change tracks. Or you might not have the capacity to pick it up. How do you move field to field or just decide to add, okay, this is important. I talked to somebody, they said I should do it. Let me add it. How do you do that?
I mean, I have also the training in that agriculture. So my habilitation was in agriculture, but on modeling. So I think I have the fortunate situation that I have insights in many different disciplines from the beginning on. What I learned and what I did from the beginning on was also to build a very interdisciplinary team, because I'm very aware that I'm not the world master in many things. So I try to attract people to my team that hold special knowledge, that I do not hold, and I cooperate with a lot of persons. And so it's easy for us as a team to pick up always new topics. For instance, our last large project in Africa was on migration pattern. We had a fancy cooperation with DLR, to get an idea by geotech tweets how people are really moving, because if you only ask them, they often tell you stories and you cannot validate.
Mm-hmm.
So we did a combination, a mixed methods approach of this tracking of interviews, and we used, of course, then also scenarios. How would climate change and land use change increase potential risks for hunger or water scarcity? Does this have an impact or not? And we had a lot of social sciences research also around. So
ethnography, oral histories, and mapping.
And mapping, of course. And what we could use, of course, again, cellular automaton is then probabilities to see how this could go on in the future. And definitively, I had to work with a lot of people which showed knowledge that I do not have personally. But we discussed it with our African colleagues, and the first question was, okay, this we want to work on, what do we need? Whom do we need? How do we get this together? And I think it was a very, very nice experience, yeah. And so that's maybe also my pleasure. I have this large team. I have a lot of doctoral students. Very often they come also with topics where I say, okay, I have a little clue, but I know someone whom I take else in the PhD committee, so that we have a good supervision and so that I can explore a lot of new topics. Now we are researching, for instance, also on human-wildlife interactions. That was also why I was in Panna Tiger Reserve, because one of my doctoral students, together with Ramesh, does a comparative study. This was important for me, between wolves in Germany and tiger in India. Yeah, on these perceptions, on the interactions that might happen and might lead to conflicts or not, and how these are managed. So this is again another field, and it is funny because I found colleagues supporting this, and it's interesting to me.
So how many PhD students have you mentored? Or in various ways, your students, on committees?
I think those who are ready, it might be 15, and currently I have roughly 18.
So a lot. And when and how did you start moving into Africa, Asia, and Latin America? Because to me, that's also one thing very unique about you. You work in Europe, but you also work very closely in these places. And in a way that is, I think, if I can characterize you correctly, very opposed to the idea of parachute science. There's a very interesting paper that's been doing the rounds recently on LinkedIn, which is, and I should share it with you, it's a paper that's 2 years old, but somehow has become very famous. And it says, my flight lands at 5 a.m., will you be there to pick me up? And it's talking about the imbalance of European scientists going to Africa and expecting the African researchers to drop everything, pick them up and take them around. And when they might go to the UK, and it's a very UK-centered paper, nobody's going to drop anything to take them around, and they're going to be data points but not concept builders. But you, I find, think of collaboration very differently. It's very much on an equal footing of collegiality, of building networks very respectfully. How did that happen?
I had a very good mentor. So I was asked in 2012 to come to Bonn to contribute to Wascal and work with Paul Fleck. And he had this mentality that research in Africa should be in Africa and with Africans, and not on Africa without Africans. Yes. And I really liked that from the very beginning on. And that helped me also to build a really good collaboration, also to accept them to be leading in cooperation and not coming me with an idea. Yeah. We can also learn a lot, particularly when it comes to participatory processes and companion modeling, or so we can learn a lot from them, because that's highly developed. I learned a lot about agent-based modeling, which I did not do before, but for them it's something very easily to approach and to conduct. And before I worked already in Asia, but there it was a little bit more difficult. I mean, there it was more this parachute, because I think good cooperation needs to grow from people, but you need to find them, So I tried in Thailand, in Vietnam, and in other countries, but very often we were only too short there to build really a good collaboration. So I try now with India, because there I have colleagues with which I know since long time. Where I think there is trust and also joint interest to do something. And that's
so trust and joint interest and staying there for a long time. 3 things that you think are important.
And Latin America was also also a little bit born from IALI. So I met some colleagues like Dolores Armenteras, Christian Echeverria, years before, and then they said, why do you not come to us and give some lectures, and let's work together, let's supervise jointly PhD students, so that step by step we can build research. We had a very nice project also in Ecuador together with ICIAM, the University of the Amazon, where we try to see how the different forest types in Ecuador can be developed, particularly better connected, to enable the movement of species. So, and that was also their idea. So they said, let's do this together. There is an opportunity, and then we developed jointly the idea. Yeah.
And if you then think back, because again, this is a unique perspective, looking at research cultures in Europe, in Latin America, and Africa, and South Asia. What would you think are the strengths of each? Because each place will have its own kind of research culture.
I think African research is insofar has a huge power when it comes to this participatory research. And also to this question of really looking at the social processes in an ecological environment. I think they do quite a lot on that. They have, of course, if you think on the CGIAR institutes, also extremely well-developed research at world-class level. I think they are very, very open for new questions and also discussing what can we do together and how can we develop methods. In Asia, I still have to learn. I mean, India is so huge. I see a lot of wonderful research, and there for me is more the motivation. How can we enhance the exchange, particularly, because I think that's also my motivation. This being in another country, at least for a while, I had a lot of PhD students from India, but I want to send out also German students to India, because I think that would help them pretty much to learn also how different the usual environment, but also PhD development is. In Europe, I think there we have, and that's sometimes a little bit sad for me, we have well-established research, we have the research centers and universities, but very often I have the impression that research has not such a high impact because everyone is satisfied, I mean, despite maybe now climate change and biodiversity loss, there we see there is still a huge need. But if I want to transform this to policy messages, and we do, then very often we end up in this, okay, this is not relevant, or we know already how to do, and why should we now do something else? So this is sometimes a bit disappointing. As a researcher, particularly in the global south, you cannot change the world, but you can have much more impact in your case study or in your environment, and you see that ideas are taken up. And that's, of course, more fascinating as if you do something and think, okay, I have done it now and no one is interested in, I can do some publications, and that's it. There are some exceptions. Currently, I started a lot of research on age-related urban development, because we have this overaging demographic change. There is a lot of interest because the cities, as they are built now, they are not made for elderly people. So we have to change a lot, considering not only the technical infrastructure, but also the way how it's created to avoid noise or to be able to orient yourself in the urban landscape, to enable some technical support, of course, when it comes to mobility. So that's a brand new research that I started also bottom up. So colleagues came to me and said, we have an idea, would you be interested to join? I said, yes, why not?
This is a common theme across many of the interviews that I've been doing, serendipity, which is, I think, the best researchers who, I mean, if you're looking at 30 years later of, a long research career, is that to be open to ideas.
Yes,
right? and
to questions.
And questions and curiosity, as you said, but also courage.
Yes, and also sometimes creativity. And that's where I come back to interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. If you stick only in a very narrow area of your original discipline, then there might be questions that you cannot answer.
Yeah.
So it's very often the case that I go to another discipline to learn how do they solve problems. And then I try to transform to let me say, a kind of interdisciplinary method. There's still not enough journals and studies ways how to do that. And there is no big methodological basis, because many people say, okay, if you do soil science, you do soil science. If you do biological research, and so on. And I think it would be very helpful if we come to more interdisciplinary methods in the future.
I also think it would be very helpful if we can highlight the fact that people like you, let's say, if you move to interdisciplinarity, your career has not suffered. In fact, it has grown. And this is a common perception. Even now, when I speak to colleagues of my age, who've been doing, let's say, 30 years of work, who have stayed in the disciplinary focus, I get comments like, you've been very brave to take these risks because when you do that, then your science suffers. And I'm looking at this and think, no, everybody that I know who does this, their science has not suffered. In fact, they publish better, they publish more, they get more grants, things. But also you make real world impact. You feel satisfied.
Definitively, but it's still not so easy. I mean, when I started with my, let me say, colorful research, there were only very little journals where you could publish interdisciplinary studies. So I even funded one on my own because I was so pissed off. It was called Cases, Change and Adaptation in Social Ecological Systems. But at the end, then many more showed up. So it was degraded. So we shut it down and said, okay, there's also land, for instance, which was started by Global Land Program. So there would have been too much overlap. And I think now the situation is different. I see it also because my PhD students, they should publish and they should be successful. We have still the fact that, for instance, in the National Science Foundation or also in the European Research Council, they are very disciplinary. And if you submit interdisciplinary projects, you don't get the reviewers. That's still a problem.
Reviewers are a problem because I find that in journals also. It's not so much the journal that is not open to it, but the reviewers, in each field, they want you to do enough to satisfy that field. And you cannot in an interdisciplinary paper.
Yes, and I think this is something which should also be part of the training of our students, I mean, we had it at the Center for Development Research where I worked for a while in Bonn, and there the students had the disciplinary and interdisciplinary training. And I think this is relevant because if you don't understand other disciplines, you will never be brave enough to approach them and to say, let's do something together.
Exactly.
Or also, I remember my own career when I started with my first big research project, there were policy scientists in. And that was for me really a struggle because I understood they like to discuss. And for them, the objective is not to have a result, but the objective is to have this discursive pathway. Right. And that was for me very difficult to accept at the beginning because I was trained in natural sciences with statistics and all these things. And then
hypothesis, deduction, falsify. Output.
Exactly. And for them, it's completely different. And also, I mean, now I use a lot of qualitative methods in research, but I had to learn them from the scratch because we also had no training. But we do now for our PhD students because it's relevant and it's helpful. But still, sometimes they struggle. I have, for instance, one nice PhD student from India now, Nimisha Shrivastava. And she does this work on human-wildlife interactions. And there you have a lot of qualitative data, a lot of interviews, surveys, in-depth interviews. And she was also at the beginning very skeptical if this is really research. I said, yes, it's research. It's relevant and very valuable.
It reminds me of when I started working with surveys about 20 years ago, when I moved to work with Eleanor Ostrom and we were looking at surveys. And trained again as a natural scientist, my idea was often, how is this not a just so story? But in the end, I found now it's so useful, to enrich what you're doing, but also because of the natural science training, I often find that if a PhD student is not alive to that training, sometimes they pick the one story out of the 200 that fits their narrative. And you also have to say yes and no. I mean, because you can add the flavor, but really you should be looking at the dominant story and then identifying the outliers to talk about why it is an outlier.
This is where I like qualitative methods, particularly to discuss findings where you say, okay, there must be something behind which I cannot explain from the data that I have so far. So that's I discussed it also now with some other Indian students. I said you need to add qualitative research, because otherwise you will collect data also from remote sensing. You see pattern, but also the way back to history. And if you want to develop recommendations, how to go to the future, it's also about the susceptibility of people, what they accept. Yeah.
Exactly.
If you develop recommendations on dealing with wildlife, and
you haven't talked to people as part of the process. Then,
and I mean, it's also relevant to say, how do I do that? So, for instance, we try to work always with different cohorts in age, and we look on these gender aspects, we look on origin and education, and that helps us pretty much to understand better.
Absolutely.
What could be done. Yeah.
So I have two main questions that I want to ask you now. One is, when you said pattern to process, I was thinking of landscape ecology, because of course, landscape ecology at its core is how do you link landscape what pattern which you see from remote sensing or models or whatever else to human processes or ecological processes or climate processes. And then you took a very admirable call, but not an easy call, I think, to be the president of the International Association of Landscape Ecology, which is across countries, which has a meeting once every 4 years, which is a fairly massive effort for 4 years. And also you're now the vice rector of research at your university, right? And how science administration is important, but it's also cost to our research. It helps build networks. It helps in the end to push the envelope of research for the world or for your university or whatever across. But for you, it's a personal cost. How do you balance the two? How do you find the motivation to do it? What have been your challenges?
I mean, for Halle, I have to say I started before to build with colleagues a virtual European Land Use Institute, because we saw we need to connect and we need other networks than those that we have before. And so I met Felix Kienast, my preceding president, and he said, why could you not do this? And for me, it was not something that hindered me in research, but contrary-wise, I could contact much more people and learn much more. And I really liked that effort. I mean, of course, we had to struggle also with some problems, also with chapters where the payment is not working because they are in countries which are a little bit disconnected. But at the end, it's really something very fruitful for my own work, because then I could, again, contact a lot of people and ask them, okay, let's do something together, or let's also write something together. So I found it very nice. The position now is a little bit a struggle, yes, because I mean, I definitively had no plans about that. I only wanted to be in our academic senate because I perceived that some processes at our university are not running well. And if I see something is not running well, I want to change. And then I was asked if I am interested to do that. And I said yes, but then I want to combine research with internationalization and transfer, because these are the parts really not very well developed, where we could do much more, particularly transfer and outreach. Is one of my hobbies, where I think, universities are way too far away from society, and there we should invest more. So it consumes a lot of my time, definitively, but I had this luck to have a really good team that I built over years, and they helped me to overcome. So without their support and their work, it would not have been possible.
So team, community, or trust, spending time, investing in relationships is coming out through your talks, right?
Exactly.
And then I have to move to the other theme that interests me, which is also, I think, for you, about building teams. I know you have a strong personal interest in, and we're actually on International Women's Day talk having this conversation. So you have a strong personal interest in building the capacity of young women to take on leadership positions. And you've had that for a very long time.
Yes.
So why and how has that interest, did that come to you? Is it because you saw that women were getting underrepresented in leadership positions? And what do you do? Again, I know you've been mentoring and nurturing young people, but what is an advice that you would give to, let's say, women coming into mid-level career positions, saying, how do you then encourage younger women like this?
I mean, when I started my research, forestry was very male dominated at the beginning. And sometimes you really felt awful as a woman because they told you, what are you doing here? This is a male job. I said, no, I see it differently. I want to do that. And I also perceive it still in our university processes, particularly when it comes on the approval of new professors. Very often you have the old networks behind, and the younger, often better women are somehow kicked out in a way that I consider to be very illegally and very confrontative. So that's my motivation to really change this. I do a lot of mentoring because I had to struggle my own to find my position. I had good mentors, actually. But I also was faced sometimes to situations where I said, okay, guys, this is now an unfair play and I need to change something. I think mentoring is particularly helpful when you are faced to such situations where you do not know how to react. Is this only because of me, or is this more a general trend? So there it helps pretty much to analyze and also to find a way out.
And to know you're not alone.
To know you're not alone, to share experiences in these situations. I try to push a lot of young women to not be shy, to go that way of becoming at least a PhD. Very often, and that's what makes me sad, they are hesitating to take the next step. So I would be willing to push them to go to professor positions because we still have too little. I mean, at my university, we have only 30% of women professors, and it's the first time since 500 years that we have a female rector and a rectorate that is dominated by females. So that's really something which shows that even our society, in a hidden way, is very patriarchistic and not so open as we often claim to do. So I think support, good networks, that's essential, and also, let me say, some formats where you are trained how to deal with uncomfortable situations or with colleagues that blame you. What I would recommend is really to think on networking from the beginning, not to start it afterwards, but already in your PhD or maybe already at master level, to approach people to say, okay, I want to work together with you, to be open also for opportunities. So I have many young that came in and said, I want to do the master thesis, and afterwards they got stuck and said, I want to stay in this team and also do my PhD thesis, and no, I do not want to leave. I apply for projects to stay in this team. So that's how it was growing. And meanwhile, we are even blamed that we disfavor men, which is definitely not the case. So it's often happening by hazard that someone approaches me and then I say, okay, let's talk and see if there's an opportunity to raise money and to support you. And somehow I think it's easier for young female scholars to approach women. So if I compare it with the teams of my other colleagues, definitively we have the highest level of internationality and female researchers. So
I find that a lot also. Women tend to approach the women who are older, not because necessarily the women are much, but somehow there's something that they feel more comfortable. Maybe it's looking for a role model like you, that someone has made it.
And I think they can speak more openly, also about problems, about fears, about their situation, and I think that's very important because as a supervisor, you are not only responsible for the, let me say, methodological and scientific part, but also a little bit for human development.
Absolutely.
And I think this is very often neglected. We do it often also in a team because, as I told before, I'm not a knowledge holder in all aspects of the research we do. So we have an open team, someone is presenting the state of art or questions, and then we discuss. And very often there's someone in the team who says, okay, I worked on the same thing, or I read something, or there's a colleague you can contact. And so we support each other much more than it could be done in a, let me say, bilateral supervision.
That's wonderful. And then maybe my last question for you, which is more a personal question. As women, we often balance multiple responsibilities. So you have your administrative responsibilities. We talked about those. You have your work responsibilities in your research and your mentoring and all this, the travel, because collaborations are rewarding, but they take time, especially if they're international. We didn't talk about the personal, which is also the fact that often one wants time for oneself, but have other responsibilities. I know you have elderly parents, as do I. Caregiving takes a lot of time, and women have it very often one way or the other, whether it's looking at children or parents or both sometimes.
Yeah.
How does one balance all of this while still keeping a little sane, a little healthy, keeping time for oneself?
I'm not sure if it's able to balance it. I mean, I made the decision very early that family is nothing for me, because I was so curious to learn more about the world, and then you need to find a partner who can accept this. So I said, okay, I think that would not be sustainable for neither of one side, so it's better to stay alone. Of course, I have my parents. I have to care for them, and I do, but also there I'm looking for networks, for support, because you cannot manage things only alone. You always need persons to be involved, to share things, but otherwise, other way around. I have, for instance, a neighbor who is very sick, so sometimes I'm caring for him because he has no family anymore. So, but he's caring then when I'm away from my house. So I think it's receiving something and giving something back. And then you can manage a lot of things. And also, I mean, with this high administration load, but I built now a wonderful team also in the Vice Rectorate. And I give them freedom. Yeah, they can decide. I try to push them to give them also the opportunity to take any further education they want to have. And then you see they are starting burning for that. And then they take over a lot of things that before I had to do on my own. Now we can share, and I can go for new things that I could not do before because lack of time. So I think this is a little bit the reasoning how I'm working. Yeah.
This is beautiful. So I think if I have to summarize what the learnings were from today's conversations, community, networks, reciprocity. And we discussed this a little bit before, when it seems at times like this, the world is falling into a crumble, right?
Oh, yes.
There's so many things going on everywhere. Maybe what we can all do is to build community and build our own communities.
And I think it's absolutely, that's what I fear, that we lose this community sense in the world, and only a global community can avoid a really critical crisis. I mean, we have it already. We see climate change. We see this tremendous biodiversity loss, but we cannot work on small scale. We have to work together and also share resources for that. And that's a little bit my hope for the future, that people acknowledge that it is needed. Of course, there is a process of consensus building. There will be conflicts always. But if we go not step by step, a little bit forward, a little bit more trust, a little bit more cooperation, then we would not save our planet.
That's a lovely note on which to end. So, Christine, thank you so much for this absolutely wonderful conversation. And I'm sure people will be very interested in listening to it, because so many insights, I think, for our future. So thank you again.
Thank you so much for that nice conversation.